This is Clay Rooks at City College. Today I'm going to talk to you about comparison and contrast. The first thing I suppose we should do is we should define what these terms are. Comparison is when you show how things are similar or how they're alike in some way. And contrast then is how you show how things are different. What are the reasons then for using comparison and contrast? Actually, there's several reasons that we use comparison and contrast. It can be usually used for decision making, for clarifying choices, for explaining alternatives, for showing advantages and disadvantages. Now, we do this in everyday life, and you may not be aware that you're doing it. But when you, for example, do something like you go to buy a new DVD player, and you compare this one and that one, and you look at what features are the same and what features are different, you are using comparison and contrast to make your decision. Or, for example, say that a friend of you from Australia is talking about rugby, and you don't really understand what he's talking about with rugby. Well, he could compare it to football, and then there would be some things that you would see about it that were similar so that you would understand what rugby's like. Now, there are three patterns that you can use for showing comparisons or contrasts. They are subject by subject, point by point, and the combined pattern. And we're going to look at each of these in a little more detail. Subject by subject. This one's a little bit confusing to us because we usually think of as a subject as being a topic that we're talking about. But in comparison and contrast, by subject they mean a thing or an item. In other words, thing one versus thing two, or like that, okay? So let's pick a topic. We'll pick alternative power sources, all right? And let's say we're going to compare ethanol, natural gas, and electric power sources. These would be identified as our subjects. Now, we'd have to discuss the points of each one of those, how they're the same, or if you're doing contrast, how they're different. So we would compare, say, the cost, the efficiency, the convenience, and the safety of each one. Now notice that if we are going to do cost, efficiency, convenience, and safety for one of these, we have to do it for all of them. And it's best if we also do them in the same order. On the other hand, point by point just kind of turns it around. I want to show you this because some textbooks are a little confusing on this. It doesn't matter what a topic is or what the points are, whether you use the subject by subject pattern or the point by point. We can do the same thing using the topic of alternative power sources and do the same layout but by points instead of by subjects. In this case, the points that were being compared were the cost, the efficiency, the convenience, and the safety. If we put it in the point by point pattern, then we bring in the subjects. So we have the cost. We would talk then about ethanol, natural gas, and electric. We would then discuss efficiency of power sources and talk about ethanol, natural gas, electricity, and then convenience and safety and so on. You see the pattern here that it works in, okay? Now, subject by subject is used basically, it is most useful when you have only a few points of comparison or contrast, say 3 to 4. This is about as many points as the average person can hold in their mind at one time and compare different objects. Alright? And so this is used also for fairly short papers. Then again, if you have a more complex topic with lots of points to discuss, then it's most useful to use the point by point pattern, especially if there's, say, 4 or more points of discussion. If you're discussing a complex topic, for example, there might be 14, 15 points of comparison. That would be too many for a person to hold in their head at one time. So you would switch then to using the point by point pattern. and this of course would be for longer papers. Now, how do you then put together a paper if you're using the subject by subject or the point by point pattern? Actually, it's pretty simple. Here is our subject by subject layout when we were doing ethanol, natural gas, electric. So what you do is simply you put an introduction on the front end of it. Then you discuss subject 1, ethanol, cost, efficiency, convenience, safety. Then you discuss subject 2, natural gas, cost, efficiency, convenience, safety. Then you discuss subject 3, electric, cost, efficiency, convenience, safety. And then a conclusion. Alright, so that's the way you set up this type of a paper. It's pretty straightforward. Now, with point by point, it's pretty much the same, only this time the points are your leading ones. Alright, so you start a course with an introduction. Then you discuss point 1, costs, and you discuss costs of ethanol, natural gas, electric. And then point 2, efficiency. You discuss ethanol, natural gas, electric. And then you discuss point 3, convenience, ethanol, natural gas, electric. And then point 4, safety. You discuss ethanol, natural gas, electric. And then a conclusion. As you can see, these fall into some very simple patterns, and they're quite easy to use. Alright? Remember, the way you pick your pattern depends entirely on how many points do I have to compare or contrast. If it's only a few, subject by subject works fine. If it's many, then point by point works best. Now there's also one known as the combined pattern. This one is used mostly when you have to discuss not just comparisons or contrasts, but both. When you're asked to compare 2 or 3 or 4 things and also contrast them in the same document. In that case, the pattern looks like this. You have an introduction, then you have a section on comparisons, then you have a section on the contrast, the differences, then you have a conclusion. Now, do the similarities have to go before the differences? Not necessarily. However, most of the time when a decision is being made, the decision is made on how things are different, not how they're the same. Okay? Alright. Now, there's a special form of comparison known as an analogy. An analogy is often used when you are comparing two otherwise dissimilar things. Usually it's one that's more commonly known and one who's not well known or is complex in nature. An analogy would be like your counselor talking to you about the ladder to success. Okay? Now we know that, success in life isn't as easy as climbing a ladder, but it's a comparison. Alright? Or perhaps you had a coach like I did as a kid who talked about the game of life is like a ball game. There's the goal at the end of the field, you have to be a team player, you have to work together, those kind of things. Okay? Those are analogies. Analogies rely on human imagination in order for them to be understood and to work. But they can be very useful if used well. Let me give you an example. Let's say that in a science class you are given the assignment to explain the human circulatory system. Now, for many people this would be rather difficult. However, it might be easier to explain it if you used an analogy. In other words, you compared something difficult to something more commonly understood. Like, let's compare the human body to a house. Now, at first this seems odd, but look at the comparison. Alright? When we're talking about the circulatory system in the human body, we'd have to discuss the veins and the arteries, the heart, the blood, the valves. Now, explaining this and how they work together can be rather complex. However, if you said, well, look at it this way. The veins in the human body are like the pipes in a house. And the heart in the body is like the pump. the blood is like the water, and the valves are like the faucets. Now, something that was very complex seems a little bit more comprehensible and easy for many people to understand. It's like, oh, okay, I kind of get that, all right? The circulatory system in the human body is kind of like the plumbing in a house. I understand that a little bit better now. Okay, let me give you another example of an analogy that might be a little bit closer to home for some of you. Let's talk about the internet. Now, everybody, of course, is always using and talking about the web. Well, is the internet actually a web? I mean, this is what most of us, would think of as a web. Now, remember, I was a professional writer and editor. I was not an artist, obviously. But this is actually a web. There's a spider up there at the top, and there's a fly down below, and they're sitting on a web. Now, however, the analogy is useful for at least explaining or giving a concept to people who are not technical or who aren't experts in electronics. How does the web and the internet work? Well, look at the web. All right, there's the spider. How many different routes does the spider have to get to the fly? In this case, the spider would be you and your computer. The information you want would be the fly. As you can see, there are many dozens and dozens of ways that the spider could go around that web and eventually get to the fly, which is an analogy to how information is found in the World Wide Web when your computer goes out searching for something you're looking for. So it's actually a pretty good analogy, but it really doesn't look like a web, and it really isn't a web, all right? At least not electronically. It's different than that. However, computers have spawned other terms that are also analogies, and some of these are very common to you. For example, we use terms like virus and bug and worm. Well, when you say my computer has a virus, you mean it's sick? It's got a cough, it's got a runny nose? I mean, of course not. That's ridiculous. But we understand that viruses make you sick. And if your computer has a virus, it's, if you will, sick. It doesn't work right. It's not working the way it should. All right? Or also with a bug. What's a bug? Well, if you have a bug, it's also a problem. Things aren't right. Or you could say, well, I was attacked by a worm. Now, of course, there aren't really worms in the computer or in the internet. But by using these analogous terms, most of us who are not electronic engineers can at least have some concept of what it is that's going on in something that's a very complex technical system. So as you see, analogies can be very useful in very many different ways. So what do I want you to take away from this lesson about comparison and contrast? Well, to remember that we're talking about how things are similar and how they're different, and how we can use that and make decisions and show comparisons of things, and how things have alternatives in that, okay? And to also remember that there's 3 basic patterns you can use to show this information: subject by subject, point by point, or the combined pattern when you are doing comparisons and contrasts. And also to remember that there's a special form of comparison known as an analogy, which relies on the human imagination to make something that's complex or difficult to understand more easily understood. And these can help us quite a bit. All right, that's enough for now.